Born from centuries of incest, Francisco de Paula carried a lineage so tangled it crushed the mind before the body. He spoke like a ghost, obeyed like a child, and smiled like someone who had forgotten how. Chronic depression dulled his soul. A crooked jaw, drifting eyes, trembling hands. His body whispered what his blood already screamed. This prince was born not to reign, but to decay. He was born into the heart of a crumbling empire. March 10th, 1794. El Escorial Palace, Spain. A place built to inspire reverence, now echoing with the sounds of decline. Prince Francisco de Paula of Bourbon and Parma came into the world not as a symbol of renewal, but as a final echo of something already beginning to rot. His parents, King Charles IV of Spain and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, were first cousins, heirs to two of Europe's most interbred dynasties, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. This was not a scandal. It was policy. For centuries, royals had married within their own bloodlines to preserve crowns, secure alliances, and protect dynastic claims. But every sealed union of cousin to cousin left a crack behind, invisible at first, then slowly widening. By the time Francisco was born, the blood in his veins had looped too many times through the same corridors of royal ancestry. He was a child of entanglement, a prince wrapped in a ribbon of repetition. And the result? Quiet and strange. He didn't cry often as an infant. Nurses thought him serene. But by his second year, they began to notice. He stared too long without blinking. He seldom reached for toys. He rarely laughed. While his siblings ran in the courtyards, Francisco sat in doorways and watched the shadows move across the stones. By age 5, his mother had grown concerned enough to send letters. "He is sweet," she wrote, "but always distant. I do not know what lives in his mind." He was not violent. He was not rebellious. He simply obeyed. As the youngest of 7 children, Francisco had little chance of ruling anything. His elder brothers held military ranks. His sister, Maria Luisa, was sent to Naples to be queen. Even Don Carlos, whose rigid fanaticism would later ignite civil war, had a role to play in the kingdom's future. But Francisco? He was not groomed for power. He was kept in soft rooms and quiet halls, like a vase too delicate to be useful. What the court saw, they tried not to mention. But some envoys did. A report from the Austrian ambassador in 1816 described the young prince bluntly. His face is long and solemn, with an odd slope to the left jaw. One cheekbone protrudes more than the other. Another, from France in 1823, noted with less tact. His eyes do not meet evenly. One appears to look through the person, the other away. Even his posture was peculiar. His shoulders curled slightly forward, as if protecting himself from a blow that never came. His fingers, when writing, trembled faintly. His signature wobbled like ink dropped in cold water. But it was not the face, nor the eyes, nor even the stooped frame that haunted those who knew him. It was his silence. Francisco did not speak unless spoken to. And even then, his answers were brief, dry, oddly detached. One courtier noted that he replies like someone translating from another language he barely knows. Inside, something had dimmed, or perhaps had never fully lit. Today, historians would call it chronic depression, a cold, persistent kind that doesn't scream or sob, but dulls every edge of life until even happiness feels like a ghost. Emotional blunting, they now say. Dissociative traits. Dependent personality disorder. Labels that did not exist in Bourbon Spain, but lived quietly in Francisco's flesh. He was not insane. He was not dangerous. He was simply unanchored. And yet, this man, this quiet, trembling, strangely built man, carried within him the very threads of Spain's royal future. He would go on to marry Luisa Carlota, his niece, not for love, not for desire, but because the blood said so. She was bold, clever, dominating. He, as always, obeyed. Their children would continue the Bourbon line, but not in glory. One son would become Francisco de Assis, the infamous king consort to Queen Isabella II, a man mocked across Europe, a man whose own wife despised him, a man whispered to be impotent, homosexual, and irrelevant. And behind that man stood the one who bore him. Francisco de Paula was not a tyrant, not a reformer, not a saint. He did not leave behind war, law, or innovation. He left behind a quiet tremor in the bones of a dying dynasty. In his early years, when he was paraded in court in fine clothing, some called him the soft prince. He was dressed well, moved gently, and bowed perfectly, but his smile never quite reached his cheeks. When asked to dance, he complied. When told to leave, he complied. When ignored, he complied. The very traits that made him safe also made him invisible. He did not resist his fate. He barely acknowledged it. His life was not a battle. It was a slow erosion, shaped not by choices, but by the shape of his blood. He had no scandals, no victories, no personal revolts, only the quiet tragedy of someone born too late, too close, and too wrong to matter. He was not forgotten because of what he did. He was forgotten because of what he was. The final whisper of a family line that had curled too tightly around itself, until it could no longer breathe. A portrait was once commissioned of Prince Francisco de Paula when he was 22. The artist, a court favorite known for flattering even the plainest nobles, spent 3 weeks attempting to correct what nature had written too clearly. The result was a painting with uneven shadows, where the left side of the face seemed to melt ever so slightly into the background. When the Queen Mother saw it, she quietly asked for it to be moved to a hallway with less light. It never returned to public view. Francisco was born royal, but not made for display. His face betrayed what his title tried to conceal. That blood, no matter how blue, can spoil under pressure. His jaw slanted slightly to the left, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent off-center line. One cheekbone pushed forward, the other recessed. When he spoke, the words came out with a softness that wasn't gentle. It was uncertain. Courtiers learned to lean in, to pretend they heard him even when they didn't, because to ask him to repeat himself felt cruel. The eyes were the most unsettling. From a distance, they seemed normal. But up close, under candlelight, or in tense moments, one could not help but notice. They didn't look the same way. The right eye focused. The left drifted slightly outward, especially when he was tired or anxious. A subtle strabismus, perhaps. But in the ballroom mirrors and family portraits, it was enough to make observers uneasy. "He looks at you," one French diplomat wrote, "as though one half of him sees you clearly, while the other half is lost somewhere else." It wasn't an exaggeration. Francisco's face carried the unmistakable signs of degeneration, not severe enough to alarm physicians, but obvious enough to stir whispers in the drawing rooms. He was the quiet echo of the Bourbon-Habsburg experiment, where marriages were drawn not by affection, but by bloodlines stacked on top of each other like fragile glass. And yet, it wasn't just the face. It was the way he held himself. He walked with a cautious stoop, as if always trying to avoid stepping on something sacred. His shoulders hunched naturally, not from age or labor, but from a lifetime of retreating inward. His chest was narrow, his frame slight, and his neck often craned forward. To some, it looked like reverence. To others, submission. The trembling in his hands began in adolescence. At first it was barely noticeable. A flutter when he lifted a cup, a hesitation when brushing dust from his coat. But over the years, it worsened. By his 30s, his handwriting had become jagged, the kind that shook at the end of every flourish. One court clerk noted, "When he signs his name, it looks as if the ink is nervous." Physicians speculated, though never publicly. Some suspected early Parkinsonism. Others believed it was stress, the weight of royal scrutiny pressing on a nervous system that had never been strong. A few, in hushed tones, blamed the blood itself, but no diagnosis could undo the discomfort of his presence. Francisco was not ugly. He was unsettling. And in a court obsessed with symmetry, poise, and the delicate elegance of old aristocracy, unsettling was worse than unattractive. He was draped in velvet, adorned in medals, surrounded by servants, and yet he looked perpetually out of place. Like a boy who had wandered into a room meant for kings and hadn't yet figured out how to leave without being noticed. During formal gatherings, his presence became a puzzle. Where to seat him? Near the front, out of respect, or further back, where the sight of his uneven stare wouldn't distract visiting dignitaries? At a banquet in 1826, he was placed next to a minor princess from Bavaria. The girl later confessed to her governess that his face looked kind but broken, like a doll dropped once and carefully glued back together. He seldom laughed. He rarely initiated conversation. When spoken to, he responded politely, always politely, with a small nod and the kind of smile that looked borrowed from someone else. His silences were not cold, but empty, like a bell that had forgotten how to ring. But beneath the surface, deeper than the cheekbone asymmetry, deeper than the wandering eye, there was something more fractured. His servants noted how long he stared at books without turning the pages. They recalled evenings where he would walk to the window, look out over the gardens, and remain there, unmoving, for an hour. When asked what he was thinking, he would shrug, or say nothing, or smile faintly, as if the question itself was too large to answer. The priests who attended to his spiritual needs described him as devout, but it was not the passion of faith. It was ritual, repetition. His prayers were murmured in the same tone as his greetings, as though life itself was a ceremony he had been assigned to perform without ever being told why. The palace doctors tried to chart his behavior, discreetly. One noted a blunting of emotional range. Another described him as present but dulled, like a candle behind fogged glass. Yet in public, no one named it. Because what would they say? That a prince of pure Bourbon blood, heir to centuries of tradition, had been born wrong? That his eyes were strange, his mouth crooked, his voice too faint, his body too unsure? No. That was not how Spain spoke of its sons. So they called him gentle. They called him thoughtful. They praised his humility, his discretion, his quiet dignity. And in doing so, they made him disappear. Behind every portrait that was never painted, behind every speech he was never asked to give, behind every decision made without his name, the crooked face remained, pressed into the edges of royal memory like a crease no one dared unfold. Francisco de Paula was not hated. He was not mocked. He was simply misaligned, like a gilded frame meant to house something beautiful, but hung just slightly off-center, in a room no one entered anymore. In the House of Bourbon, marriage was never about love. It was about blood. How to preserve it. How to fold it neatly back into itself. How to stamp out threat and scandal by turning cousins into spouses, uncles into fathers-in-law, aunts into mothers. For Francisco de Paula, even this was not a decision. It was a sentence from man, signed before he was old enough to know what choosing meant. He married Luisa Carlota of Naples and Sicily in 1819. She was his niece, the daughter of his older sister, Maria Isabel. A girl raised on the same principles, the same piety, the same choreography of obedience and control. But unlike Francisco, Luisa had not been born to fade. She entered every room as if she had built it. Her voice never trembled. Her eyes did not drift. She was 17, he was 25. And from the beginning, she was louder than him. Louder in thought, louder in presence, louder in every space they shared. The court described her as vivacious. Others said sharp. But to Francisco, she must have seemed like a tide, steady, unrelenting, impossible to hold back. She spoke for both of them in public. When letters arrived, she replied. When invitations came, she chose which ones to accept. When the king consulted their household, it was her handwriting in the margins of every letter. Francisco, in turn, nodded. He signed what she gave him. He sat beside her at formal functions, like a statue transported from one seat to another, dressed in ceremonial lace, draped in medals, but never heard. No one doubted who ruled that marriage. It wasn't cruel. Luisa Carlota didn't strike him, didn't isolate him, didn't scream across marble floors. But she had no need to. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in silk, passed through shared glances and closed doors. The silencing of Francisco was not abrupt. It was gradual, the slow tightening of space around him until there was none left that belonged to him alone. At first, he was merely consulted less often. Then, not at all. His opinions were politely acknowledged, then quickly redirected. Over time, even servants began to defer to her first, and to him only afterward, as courtesy demanded. There was a rumor, not entirely hushed, that Luisa Carlota once told a chambermaid, "He is kind, but kind men are best kept quiet." She managed the estates. She arranged the marriages of their children. She selected tutors, planned relocations, hosted diplomats, and, in at least one case, engineered a family alliance without her husband's knowledge. When Francisco found out, he simply said, "If it brings peace, then it is well." It was not submission in the name of harmony. It was a resignation forged from something deeper, a man who had been taught, from birth, that silence was survival. Some nights, he walked alone in the southern gardens of their residence, his footsteps careful, his posture curved inward as though retreating from his own thoughts. A lady-in-waiting once described seeing him from a window. He looked like someone waiting to be told it was time to go back inside. There were children, many in fact. But even here, his presence was spectral. It was Luisa who scolded, who praised, who arranged their futures like chess pieces on a fading board. The children learned early that their mother made decisions, and their father signed them. In private letters, Francisco's words remained as muted as his speech. He referred to his wife as the organizer, sometimes the protector. Never beloved, never partner, never confidant. Not even once. He did not resent her, or if he did, the feeling never surfaced. His emotional range remained blunted, as if he had long ago lost the map back to himself. A priest noted that His confessions are always factual, never weighted. He recounts life the way one recounts the weather. Even in moments of humiliation, and there were many, he did not protest. Once, during a family dispute over succession claims, Luisa Carlota publicly criticized Francisco's indecisiveness in front of their adult children. He bowed his head. He said nothing. Not even after they left the room. Another time, when one of their daughters was nearly forced into a politically dangerous marriage, Francisco raised concerns. Quietly, tentatively. Luisa waved him off. The engagement proceeded. He attended the ceremony, sat in silence, and later wrote only one line in his diary. "The world moves forward, with or without me." Such passivity wasn't cowardice. It was the reflex of a man conditioned to disappear. Psychologists today would call it dependent personality disorder, a chronic, deeply ingrained need for others to assume control, born of environments where resistance equaled punishment. For Francisco, whose childhood was governed by a queen mother more controlling than loving, and whose adult life was dictated by a wife sharper than any minister, dependence wasn't a failing. It was his only language. And still, it hurt. Not violently, not loudly, but in the way mold grows in silence, from the corners, slowly, without being named. By the 1830s, his role in court was ceremonial at best. He stood beside his wife at audiences, but rarely spoke unless addressed directly. In royal paintings, he was present but peripheral. The brushwork around his figure always seemed dimmer, as if the artists, too, knew he did not cast a strong shadow. Francisco was still an infante of Spain. He still carried a title, wore the insignia, dined at state banquets. But he was not a man who shared power. He was a man married into disappearance. And what was left of him? A quiet signature beneath proclamations he didn't write. A bowed head beside a voice that wasn't his. A face turned slightly away in every family portrait. Eyes just drifting, mouth just off-center. Francisco de Paula was not defeated. He was absorbed. And in the quiet corners of palace life, where power moved behind curtains and obedience was mistaken for virtue, he became what no prince is trained to become. An echo of someone who never got to be loud enough to matter. Francisco de Paula never ruled a kingdom. He never held a military command, never shaped a constitution, never dictated terms of war or peace. Yet, through a quiet, tremulous path of lineage, he fathered a throne. And that throne, like the man himself, would fail to hold its shape. His most prominent son, Francisco de Asís, was married to Queen Isabella II of Spain. On paper, it was a union forged in Bourbon necessity, a neat closing of the bloodline loop, cousin to cousin, descendant to descendant. But behind that carefully drawn alliance lay the same web of fragility that had haunted Francisco all his life, only now passed on, tightened, and made public. From the start, the marriage was more insult than intimacy. Isabella, only 13 when the arrangement was declared, cried when she was told. She despised the idea, not because Francisco de Asís was cruel or harsh or dangerous, but because she saw in him the echo of everything her own reign was fighting to escape. Indecision, softness, silence, and decay. She once referred to him in a letter as that little man with the weak voice. He was described by foreign observers as shy, effeminate, deeply religious, and socially awkward, traits that, in a modern world, may have passed without much notice, but in the court of a ruling queen, surrounded by revolutionaries, generals, and ministers with sharpened tongues, became an open wound. Rumors, as always, came quickly. Some whispered he was impotent. Others claimed he had no interest in women. There were those who said he wore nightgowns, trimmed in lace, and perfumed his hands before prayers. Satirical prints depicted him holding a fan, avoiding eye contact, hiding behind Isabella's skirts. None of these accusations were ever confirmed. But in royal courts, perception bleeds faster than truth. And perception painted him as a man unfit to father heirs, unfit to rule beside his wife, unfit, in essence, to be royal in the way Spain demanded. Even their children were touched by doubt. Though Francisco de Assis was officially the father of Isabella's offspring, whispers persisted that some, or perhaps all, were the result of liaisons with generals, aides, and even foreign envoys. The Queen's affairs were barely hidden. She flaunted her disdain for her husband publicly. During arguments, she sometimes walked out of meetings and declared, "Speak to the bishop. My husband will offer prayers, not plans." And where was Francisco de Paula in all of this? Old, pale, and silent in the wings. He did not protest. He did not intervene. When asked by a foreign diplomat if he thought his son was mistreated, he simply shook his head and replied, "Kings are never mistreated. They are only misplaced." That line, strange, opaque, reveals everything. Francisco did not think in terms of agency or resistance. He had long since stopped imagining that his voice could redirect anything. He had handed down not just his blood, but his helplessness. A quiet, hereditary void that echoed through titles and names and ceremonial gowns. The tragedy was not in his son's weakness. The tragedy was that his son had no choice but to stand in public, exposed, where Francisco had always been allowed to hide. Francisco de Paula had been protected by irrelevance. His insignificance sheltered him from scrutiny. But his son, married to a queen, was thrust onto the stage with all the awkwardness of a man unprepared to perform. And so, a kingdom suffered. The monarchy's reputation decayed further with every insult hurled at Francisco de Assis. The image of the crown lost its masculinity, its resolve, its symbolic power. For the Spanish people, already disillusioned by corruption and instability, seeing a queen publicly scorn her husband and a king consort reduced to a ghost in brocade became more than scandal. It became a metaphor for a dynasty that had gone soft, for a crown that no longer ruled but apologized, for a lineage too entwined in itself to stand upright. The Carlists, those who supported Francisco's older brother Carlos as the rightful heir, used this to their advantage. They portrayed Isabella's rule as unnatural, and her husband as a puppet, a pale, trembling reflection of the very man who had once refused to fight for anything. Francisco's legacy, however unintentional, became political poison. No one blamed him outright. He hadn't conspired. He hadn't manipulated. But the failure of his son became his final, invisible signature on Spain's unraveling. And it wasn't just Francisco de Assis. Other children of Francisco and Luisa Carlota were married off into similar traps. Noble unions that looked ideal on paper, but fractured under pressure. One daughter was sent to Naples and described in letters as delicate, reclusive, and prone to long periods of weeping. Another was married into the French branch and vanished almost entirely from Spanish history. It was as though the family's blood, stretched thin, too tightly wrapped around itself, had lost its resilience. They wore crowns, but their heads drooped. They bore swords, but their hands shook. And at the center of this soft collapse stood Francisco, no longer young, no longer necessary, and no longer able to deny that his line was not simply fading. It was infecting what remained. He attended baptisms, weddings, funerals. He kissed his grandchildren's foreheads and posed in stiff family portraits. He was always dressed correctly. He never said the wrong thing. But in every room, there was a sense that he was being tolerated, not revered. That he was a living emblem of a story people wished had ended earlier. He lived long enough to watch Spain fracture under the weight of inherited fragility, to see revolutions rise, thrones wobble, and his own descendants mocked in the very newspapers that once honored the Bourbons as divine. And though he rarely spoke of it, one servant recorded a strange moment late in Francisco's life. While watching his grandchildren play, the prince turned and said, "They are beautiful, but I hope they do not inherit too much." He didn't explain what he meant. He didn't need to, because by then everyone in the palace already knew. The worst thing you could inherit from Francisco de Paula was not his title, or his name, or even his silence. It was the quiet kind of ruin that smiles politely and passes through generations without ever raising its voice. After the public weddings, after the ceremonies, after the headlines about his son's frail masculinity began to fade into cruel jokes. Prince Francisco de Paula began to disappear. Not physically. He still lived in palaces, still wore the sash of an infante, still dined with royalty when occasion required. But something in him began to recede, like a tide that never came back. The prince who had once stood behind others now sat behind closed doors, and eventually, not even the servants were sure how often he spoke. By the 1840s, his name appeared less and less in court records. Not removed, not dishonored, simply quieted. He was no longer expected to participate in affairs of state. No one consulted him on family disputes. When the younger generation squabbled over succession and alliances, Francisco was not invited to weigh in. He was a father, a grandfather, a royal, but functionally, a ghost. He moved into a private suite on the eastern wing of the Palacio Real in Madrid, not out of exile, but because no one asked him to stay near the center anymore. His days settled into routine. He rose early, but not to meet ministers or review troops. He would sit by the window, sometimes for hours, reading letters from relatives across Europe, many of whom no longer remembered to address him by title. He read the papers, though no article mentioned him. He walked the corridor that ran the length of his wing, 86 silent steps from end to end. Servants called it the long room because he paced it like someone trying to stay remembered by the floorboards. He rarely hosted guests, and when he did, they were often members of the clergy, older men, quieter than him, brought in more for comfort than conversation. One of them later wrote, "His Highness asked many questions, but never about the world, only about the soul, as if the news outside had ceased to concern him." When his wife Luisa Carlota died in 1844, something strange happened. Nothing. No resurgence, no liberation, no change in his daily rhythm. One might have imagined that her passing would leave a void he could now fill. But in truth, the shape of his life had already conformed so completely to her control that her absence did not open space. It left a silence exactly where silence had already been. He did not remarry. He did not pursue companionship. He did not even move into her rooms. Instead, he wrote dozens, possibly hundreds, of letters. Some addressed to his children, some to God, some to no one at all. None were sent. They were found in drawers years later, folded carefully, written in a script so delicate it looked like frost. A royal archivist who reviewed them described their contents as polite, deeply formal, and nearly void of personal sentiment, as if composed by someone imitating what a man might say. One letter, unsigned and undated, simply read, "I was not made for noise. I find comfort in corners. I hope this is not a crime." Servants came and went. Some stayed long enough to write memoirs. One footman recalled how, on particularly quiet mornings, Francisco would hum the same melody again and again under his breath. Not a hymn, not a lullaby. Just a single phrase, half remembered, always off key. He did not keep dogs, though they had been offered. He did not collect art. He refused portraits. Mirrors were covered in his chambers, not by royal decree, but by his own quiet request. And the room, that long, slow corridor of echoing marble and faded drapes, became the only place he moved freely. There he paced, not like a man in distress, but like someone trying to remain real. Visitors noticed the way he would trace his fingers along the wall as he walked, as if reassuring himself that something was still solid, that he was not yet air. At meals, he ate little. His appetite dulled, though not from illness. Food, like conversation, had become an obligation. He was courteous to the end, thanked every server, nodded at every dish, even if he barely touched it. Holidays passed. Births were announced. Crowns shifted. Europe trembled with new ideologies, new nations, new wars. But Francisco did not comment. He lived in a place where time curled in on itself like a letter never sent, and the palace allowed it. Because it was easier to forget a man who asked for nothing than to ask why he had become that way. The years stretched, then blurred. Francisco aged, but without the dignity of legacy. No chroniclers followed him. No biographers chased his footsteps. His titles remained on parchment, but his presence faded from memory. Even his children, when writing to one another, referred to him in diminishing terms. Father seems quiet. Father does not attend audiences anymore. Father remains as he has always been. It wasn't indifference. It was discomfort. No one knew what to say to a man who had lived for decades in the background, who had never once raised his voice in protest or pride. And so, he became easier to leave alone, not out of cruelty, but because his silence made space for everything else. One of the few surviving notes in his own hand from this period reads, "There is peace in vanishing slowly. I think the world prefers it." It is hard to say if he believed that. Harder still to say if he understood what had been taken from him, or if he had willingly given it away. But in that long room, with its quiet walls and dusty light, one thing is certain. Prince Francisco de Paula lived not like a man forgotten by accident, but like a man who understood, too early, that his life would make more sense as an absence than a presence. The slow decline of Francisco de Paula was not marked by drama, nor by any single visible break. There was no fit of madness, no public collapse, no moment when the court gasped and whispered that the prince had finally lost his grip. Instead, his retreat was like a dimming lantern, flickering in silence, one memory at a time, until even his own reflection no longer recognized him. By the 1850s, Francisco's behavior had become so muted, so predictable in its detachment, that no one even called it illness. It was simply his way. He rose each day, dressed with care, and greeted his attendants with a soft nod. He spoke when spoken to. He answered every question, but never with more than what was needed. Emotion had long ceased to color his voice. One chaplain described it as the sound of someone remembering how to speak, not someone who wishes to be heard. There was no laughter in him, nor anger, nor joy. His presence was polite, his gaze steady but vacant. He did not forget names, he did not misplace objects, but there was something hollow in how he remembered, as if memory to him was a library of closed books, each retrieved by habit, not affection. Royal doctors began to take private notes. Some speculated that he was suffering from a form of melancholic detachment, an outdated term that today might align with chronic depressive disorder. Others noted signs of emotional flattening, blunted affect, or even mild dissociation. But none of these terms would have mattered to Francisco. He did not ask for diagnosis. He did not ask for help. He simply existed. A man alive by all physical measures, yet increasingly absent in every room he entered. When visitors came, they often left unsure whether they had spoken to him or simply passed through his orbit. One French ambassador remarked, "He bowed, he smiled, but he did not feel there." It was like speaking to a memory dressed in flesh. Even in family circles, his absence was palpable. His children, grown now, referred to him with the affectionate distance reserved for elderly relatives who are loved, but no longer known. They visited out of duty, not warmth. They bowed. They kissed his hand. But they did not linger. Conversations remained shallow, safe. A few pleasantries, a brief inquiry about his health, and then silence, as if no one wished to peer too deeply into the void behind his eyes. Francisco didn't resist it. He welcomed the quiet. Or at least, he never refused it. He spent hours in his chamber, seated beside the same window, watching the garden walls. Not the flowers, not the trees, just the walls, as if they offered the only conversation he could still understand. Once, a servant found him tracing the edge of a bookshelf, his fingers moving slowly along the spines of unread volumes. When asked if he needed help finding something, Francisco replied, "No, I'm only reminding them that they are still here." That was the closest he came to poetry. And yet, for all his passivity, he was never neglected. The crown paid his expenses. His rooms were kept immaculate. His food was warm. His attendants were discreet. Spain had not exiled him. It had simply outgrown him, the way a tree forgets the root that once anchored it in its earliest years. He was consulted only once in his final decade, when a distant cousin sought to arrange a marriage between two minor houses in Italy. Francisco was asked for his opinion, a formality more than a request. He paused, then said, "If they are young, they may still believe it matters." And then he said nothing more. No further questions were sent. Behind closed doors, his decline became more visible. He began to respond to fewer letters. He left many unopened. He forgot meals. He wandered his long room at night, barefoot, without candles, touching the cold stone walls as if expecting them to whisper something back. One attendant, who remained with him for 10 years, wrote later in his memoirs, "He did not suffer, but it was painful to watch." Not because of what he felt, but because of how little he seemed to feel at all. He had become gentle to the point of vanishing. And perhaps that was the worst part. He did not rage against his fading mind. He did not beg to remember. He did not cry out when names slipped away or when a familiar tune no longer brought comfort. He let go as if he had always been preparing to disappear. Some believed he was afraid. Others thought he had found peace. But the truth was simpler, sadder. Francisco de Paula had been trained for obedience since birth. Obedience to his crown, his mother, his wife, and eventually to the silence itself. And when that silence began to consume his mind, he did not resist. He bowed, as he always had. He still received Mass, still made the sign of the cross, still whispered prayers in Latin with careful articulation. But the words felt rote, detached, like echoes from a boyhood he no longer remembered as his own. His confessor noted that he never spoke of guilt, never of desire, never of hope, only of structure, what time dinner would be, whether the drapes should be drawn, which saints were appropriate for rainy days. "I do not think he doubted God," the confessor wrote, "but I think he doubted his place in the world God had made." By 1860, his voice had grown so faint that servants leaned in to hear him even in small rooms. His hands, once mildly unsteady, had become too weak to hold a quill without trembling. Letters stopped entirely. He now communicated mostly by gestures, a small nod, a downward glance, a hand placed gently on the arm of an attendant. Not commands, not even requests, just quiet acknowledgments that he was still, for now, here. When storms rolled over Madrid, Francisco did not react. When firecrackers from a nearby celebration startled the palace horses, he remained unmoved. When news of political upheaval reached the capital, he simply turned away from the window and resumed watching the wall. It wasn't that he didn't understand. It was that he no longer belonged. And so, day by day, thought by thought, breath by breath, the prince who had once walked halls of power slowly vanished. Not into death, but into absence. Long before his body gave out, his mind had folded itself away, like an old letter no longer meant to be read. By the last decade of his life, Francisco de Paula no longer cast a shadow in the halls of power, not because the sun had moved, but because no one looked his way. He still wore the uniform of an infante of Spain. The medals were polished, the sash draped with exact precision, the buttons fastened as if awaiting a parade that never came. But the man beneath the fabric had become something less than a figure, and more like a placeholder, a shape dressed in ceremony, preserved out of obligation, not memory. The Spanish monarchy, fractured by years of internal disputes, liberal revolts, and the fading glow of divine right, had no need for a prince who neither spoke nor acted. Francisco remained present at official functions when requested, seated at the edge of the table, nodded toward hall by those who remembered protocol. But his contributions were as thin as the gold thread on his cuffs. He was not consulted, not criticized, not adored. He was simply included. In royal archives, his name appears on attendance lists, but not in transcripts. His signature marks proclamations he did not write. He walked in processions where he was neither welcomed nor excluded, a token of lineage, not legacy. One court diarist wrote of a state banquet in 1858. His Highness sat beside the ambassador of Prussia. They exchanged pleasantries. He smiled. He said little. When dessert was served, he looked at the candles for a long time, as if trying to remember what fire felt like. That same night, his chair was removed before the final toast. No one noticed. Francisco had become royalty by designation only. A name in family charts, a title preserved in ink, a body preserved by ritual, his position, Infante of Spain, had long lost its functional meaning. He held no lands, issued no decrees, commanded no armies. His only duty was to remain visible enough not to be questioned, and invisible enough not to be a burden. And so, he moved like a shadow that had learned how to bow. Even the palace guards, trained to offer salutes to every noble rank, adjusted their posture for him with a strange mix of precision and pity. They knew he posed no threat, expected no honor, and returned every greeting with a soft smile and a bowed head. The younger ones called him El Silencio, not mockingly, but as a kind of unofficial title, the prince who spoke through stillness, Among the servants, stories began to circulate. None cruel, all tinged with sorrow. They said he slept with the windows open, even in winter. That he no longer felt the cold. That he asked for the same chair every evening and sat in it without moving for hours. That when music played during distant rehearsals, he would tilt his head slightly, like a child listening for something half forgotten. No one feared him. No one revered him. They served him as one might tend to a museum relic, delicate, dignified, and no longer real. He had no enemies. He had no allies. He had no political alignment. When revolutions shook the country, he did not voice concern. When ministers were exiled, when generals betrayed the crown, when kings rose and fell, Francisco stood motionless, like a column too far from the battle to be hit, too forgotten to be defended. One minister, frustrated by court divisions, reportedly snapped, "At least Francisco remains loyal." Another replied, "He remains nothing. That's the difference." It wasn't meant as cruelty. It was observation. Even among the Carlists, the conservative monarchists who once rallied behind his brother Carlos, Francisco held no symbolic value. Carlos had been defiant, ideological, a martyr to a lost cause. Francisco had been silent, obedient, and absent from every battlefield, literal or political. The Carlist papers called Carlos the Lion. Francisco? They didn't call him anything at all. In portraits of the royal family, he was often painted last. In the background, near a pillar, his hands resting on a cane, his gaze off-center. The painters did not exaggerate his asymmetrical face or his slight frame. They didn't have to. The truth was already subdued enough to look like fiction. When he stood in church, he bowed his head so deeply it looked like prayer. But when asked later by a priest what he had been praying for, Francisco answered simply, "That I remember how to be still." Even the children of the court, notoriously cruel in their honesty, did not laugh at him. They tiptoed around him. When he entered a room, they fell silent, not from respect, but from confusion. To them, he was not a prince. He was a story no one told. One young noble, upon seeing him for the first time, whispered to his tutor, "Is he alive?" Yes, he was, but barely. The ghost had not died. He had simply remained, outlasting his own era, his own relevance, his own memory. And now, in the final years of his quiet wandering, he had become part of the furniture of monarchy, heavy with symbolism, light with purpose. Letters stopped arriving. Courtiers stopped making eye contact. The world outside the palace windows moved with revolutions, railways, and ideas that Francisco would never touch. And yet, inside those stone walls, he remained, wearing silk, speaking softly, nodding at shadows. He was not feared like Tiberius, not adored like Ferdinand, not debated like Carlos. He was tolerated, wrapped in ceremony like a body dressed for burial long before death arrived. And so, the prince who had once been a child of loins too closely related, who had married a niece he could never confront, who had watched his son become a national joke, now stood in courtrooms like a portrait walking upright. Not a man, not a figure, not even a memory. Just the final breath of a house that had forgotten how to speak. Legacy is not always carved in stone or sung in anthem. Sometimes it moves silently through blood, slips beneath the skin, and settles into the bone, not as glory, but as consequence. Francisco de Paula, Prince of Spain, passed down no war trophies, no constitution, no rebellion. What he gave to the generations after him was harder to name and more difficult to erase. He passed on failure, not the dramatic kind, not the failure of ambition or conquest, but a slower decay, the quiet corrosion of a dynasty from within, through weakness inherited and silence maintained. His son, Francisco de Assis, had become a national embarrassment. Married to Queen Isabella II, stripped of authority, mocked in public, pitied in private. Their marriage, more a political bandage than a union, produced children whose legitimacy was questioned from the moment they took their first breath. Gossip shadowed every baptism. Courtiers whispered that the true fathers were generals, secretaries, even musicians. And in those whispers, the name Francisco echoed, not as the guilty one, but as the source. He was the one who gave us this king, they said. He was the origin of this softness, this shame, this slipping crown. No one blamed him directly. No one accused him to his face. But behind closed doors, among ministers and monarchists desperate to find a scapegoat for the rot they could not stop, Francisco de Paula became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Not because of what he had done, but because of what he had enabled. A man too quiet to resist, a father too passive to protect, a bloodline too frail to inspire. He had sown, unwittingly, the seeds of a dynasty that would be mocked by liberals and monarchists alike. To the radicals, his lineage represented the weakness of the old world. Men dressed in lace, unable to command, hiding behind titles like curtains. To the conservatives, he was a betrayal, a Bourbon who had not fought, who had not preserved the old codes, who had allowed disgrace to bloom from his own household. And still, Francisco said nothing. He never defended his son. He never corrected the rumors. He never explained or excused. Some interpreted this silence as dignity. Others saw it as proof that even he did not believe in what he had produced. By the time Queen Isabella's reign began to collapse under the weight of public scandal, failed reforms, and civil unrest, Francisco was no longer mentioned by name. Not in speeches, not in newspapers, not even in private letters between royals. It was as if history itself had skipped him, leapt from Carlos V to Isabella II without passing through the man who had stood between. But the stain remained. In Bourbon family trees, he was a link no one wanted to examine too closely. His branch bore fruit that withered in the light. His descendants became symbols of everything fragile in the Spanish monarchy. Indecisive, unloved, overdressed, and underprepared. The very image of decline in royal clothing. Even among his own children, Francisco's presence was more echo than memory. They remembered his hands, soft, trembling, always folded in his lap. They remembered his voice, low, measured, apologetic. But they did not speak of him with warmth. They did not describe laughter or instruction or pride. One daughter reportedly said, "He was kind, but kindness without strength becomes a curse." Another, more cruelly, compared him to a tree that bore fruit only to feed disease. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is that Francisco himself seemed to agree. In his few surviving personal notes, scattered across drawers and unsent letters, there is no mention of legacy. No desire for remembrance, no assertion of pride in what he had built, only observations. Quiet, clinical, like a man watching a house crumble from the inside without ever lifting a hand to stop it. "A name lasts longer than a man," he once wrote. But names carry rot, too. He watched silently as his grandchildren were married off into cold unions, used as diplomatic pawns just as he had been. He observed the repetition of patterns. Daughters who wept in foreign courts, sons who turned bitter before adulthood, alliances that looked golden but crumbled in a single generation. And still, he did nothing. Because what could he do? His whole life had been a lesson in retreat. From his birth, the product of incestuous dynasties, to his marriage, arranged and controlled, to his old age, ignored and preserved like furniture, Francisco had never been given a path toward agency. He was not taught to shape the future. He was taught to endure it. And so, that is what he passed on. Endurance without direction, duty without desire, nobility without fire. His failure was not personal. It was hereditary, structural, a collapse that began long before him, but found in him a body too soft to resist and too polite to scream. His brother Carlos had died in exile, defiant, still honored by Carlist loyalists as a martyr for true monarchy. His niece Isabella would be overthrown, her rule disgraced, her marriage ridiculed. Between them stood Francisco, neither warrior nor ruler, just a figure who carried the poisoned blood forward with trembling hands. He lived long enough to see that what he had inherited was not a crown, but a curse, and he handed it on, because he believed he had no choice. Not every man burns the house down. Some simply forget how to lock the door, and by the time they realize it's empty, it's already too late. He died on August 13th, 1865, in Madrid, quietly, without struggle, without proclamation, without the tolling of bells or the weight of national grief. Prince Francisco de Paula, the last soft voice of a brittle line, passed from this world as he had lived in it, almost invisible. There was no crowd outside the palace, no throngs of weeping citizens clutching handkerchiefs to their mouths, no urgent dispatches to foreign courts, just a brief, restrained announcement in the court bulletin. His Royal Highness, Don Francisco de Paula, has expired in the Lord. It was not indifference. It was exhaustion. Spain, by then, had bled too much. The monarchy had fractured, re-glued, and fractured again. Revolutions had risen and fallen. Queens had been forced into exile and would be again. In this turbulence, the death of a prince who had done nothing, said little, and changed no course of history was not seen as tragedy. It was seen as an ending too long delayed. Doctors recorded the cause as heart failure, complicated by nerve degeneration. He had been increasingly weak in the final months. His hands, once only gently tremulous, could no longer hold even a spoon. His voice, already faint, faded to a whisper no one could quite hear. Toward the end, he often gazed out the window for hours, eyes unfocused, mouth slightly open, as if waiting for something that never arrived. His final words, recorded by a servant, were spoken not to anyone in particular. "I suppose this is the part where I disappear." There was no state funeral. A small cortege carried his coffin, simple, unadorned compared to others of his rank, to the royal crypt near his brother Carlos. But even that was a gesture more of protocol than reverence. The nation did not stop. No poet mourned him. No monument was commissioned in his name. He was buried, yes, but he was not remembered. In royal memory, Francisco became a footnote. No bronze bust was ever sculpted, no street named, no academic symposium held to examine his thoughts, because there were none to quote, no military campaign to revisit, no letters of vision or power to interpret. Even his personal effects were modest. A small collection of books, letters never sent, a set of rosary beads worn smooth from habitual fingers. When archivists opened his chambers after his death, they found the same long corridor, the same still air, the same sense that time had been waiting for permission to move again. A journal, half filled, was found in a drawer. Most of it contained copied passages from Scripture, written in small, elegant hand. On the last page, in a line uncharacteristically his, were 7 words. "They will forget me faster than silence." And they did. Within months, his name disappeared from official correspondence. His seat at court was not left empty in his honor. It was simply reassigned. When guests asked about the quiet man with the drifting gaze, the courtiers shrugged. "Oh, that was Francisco. He passed, you know." Nothing more. His children, still embroiled in their own reputational failures and dynastic entanglements, rarely mentioned him in letters. His granddaughter, Queen Mercedes, once asked who he was upon seeing his name on an old family tree. No one could answer with certainty. Even the church, usually the last institution to forget, struggled to summon words for his soul. A bishop assigned to deliver his eulogy spoke for less than 10 minutes. He referred to Francisco as a man of humility, of devotion, of quiet grace. But the rest was generic. Phrases recycled from past deaths applied to a prince who had made no mark to tailor them. And perhaps that was what hurt the most. Though he was gone, there was no pain left behind. No hole in the shape of him. No unfinished work. No unspoken forgiveness. Just a quiet, untroubled vacancy where a man had once been dressed in silk. When tourists visited the royal crypts in later decades, guides would rush past his name. They lingered longer at the tombs of Carlos V, Ferdinand VII, Isabella II. Names with stories, names with weight, names that stirred debate or admiration or hatred. Francisco's marker was clean, small, etched with only a title and a date. Not a word more. No epitaph, no quote, no line of scripture. As though to speak anything about him would have been to exaggerate. In historical texts, he is often left out entirely. In family charts, he is abbreviated. In public consciousness, he never existed. And yet, he was once a prince. He was once the brother of a pretender to the throne. He was once the father of a king. He was once the quiet echo behind a monarchy's collapse. But no one built a statue for a whisper. And Francisco had lived as one, spoken as one, died as one. The world did not weep. The world did not cheer. The world did what he had always done. It bowed its head, nodded politely, and moved on. Francisco de Paula was not a villain. He was not a tyrant. He shed no blood, signed no decrees, and made no demands. And yet, his name sits in the corner of a royal collapse, quietly staining the silk that once wrapped him. He was born too late into a house too tangled, asked to bear a legacy already breaking under its own weight, and he bore it without protest. He was not hated, but that is not the same as being loved. What makes a life meaningful? Is it power? Is it voice? Or is it the willingness to remain, even when erased? Francisco did not seek greatness. He never claimed it. Perhaps he feared it. Perhaps he knew he was never shaped for it. But in that refusal, in that lifelong retreat, he became something else. A mirror. Not of Spain's glory, but of its slow, genetic surrender. History rarely records the soft ones. It favors noise, violence, passion. But rot does not always arrive with a roar. Sometimes it enters dressed as obedience. Francisco's story is not a lesson in action, but in absence. He teaches us not what to do, but what happens when doing nothing becomes tradition, when silence is inherited, when weakness is made sacred by ceremony. He reminds us that not all dynasties fall by fire or sword. Some simply dissolve through the hands of men too gentle to fight back, too conditioned to speak, too blood-bound to escape. And perhaps that is the most chilling part. Because Francisco was not cruel. He was kind. He was loyal. He was quiet. But he was born wrong. Born of two close cousins, raised by two strict mothers, married to two controlling blood, and passed into history by hands that never knew how to hold. And so he stands, not as a warning about ambition, but as a haunting about decay. A man who carried the rot not in his actions, but in his marrow. A man who watched a kingdom unravel from the inside and could only bow his head and say nothing. A man history forgot, not because he didn't matter, but because everything that made him dangerous was too silent to name. We often ask, what brings down a dynasty? Tyranny? Corruption? War? But perhaps the more frightening answer is this: what if it ends because no one could bear to say no? What if it ends not in fury, but in fading? What if the most dangerous man in a kingdom is the one who was never dangerous at all?